1. Kelsey Turner. Kelsey Turner was 25 years old when she was arrested, a former men's magazine model whose photos and glossy spreads suggested aspiration and glamour. Before the crime, she cultivated a polished public image online and in Las Vegas, where she was living with her boyfriend. Behind that surface, investigators later said was a complicated relationship with Dr. Thomas Kirk Burchard, a 71-year-old California psychiatrist who had been helping her financially, including paying rent on the home where she stayed. Their connection, part mentorship, part dependency, placed Turner at the center of a life that looked enviable from the outside and unstable up close. Tensions were building long before the violence. Witness testimony described jealousy and conflict, including claims that Turner was upset by what she believed was on the doctor's phone. The same sources painted a picture of emotional volatility inside the house. A young couple struggling with money and identity, paired with a benefactor whose support blurred boundaries. Prosecutors and reporters would later describe the arrangement as intimate and financially entangled conditions that can escalate resentment and fear when control seems to slip. None of those factors excuse what happened next, but they help explain the fuse that was burning. In early March of 2019, authorities found Dr. Burchard's body in the trunk of Turner's blue Mercedes on a road near the Lake Mead National Recreation Area just outside Las Vegas. Investigators linked the car to Turner and traced evidence back to the rental house. Inside, they documented signs of a violent confrontation and hurried cleanup. A baseball bat was later recovered as key evidence. According to law enforcement and court records, Turner's boyfriend, John Logan Kennison, struck the doctor during the confrontation. Turner and her roommate, Diana Pena, were implicated in the cover-up that followed. Turner left Nevada and was arrested in California. Kennison was taken into custody in Las Vegas. Detectives built their case on physical evidence, witness cooperation, and the abrupt movements of the household after the killing. Pena pleaded guilty to being an accessory and ultimately testified, describing the hours after the assault and the efforts to hide what had occurred. Facing trial, Turner entered what is known as an Alford plea to second-degree murder, acknowledging that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict while not admitting guilt. In January of 2023, a Nevada judge sentenced her to a term of 10 to 25 years with eligibility for parole after a minimum of 10. The court also heard the grief of the doctor's longtime partner, who described financial deception and the devastating loss of a gentle man beloved by his patients and community. Kennison tried separately received a sentence ranging from 18 to 45 years. What motivated Turner experts did not diagnose a clinical condition in open court, but the record points to a toxic mix of dependency, jealousy, and self-preservation. The financial lifeline from Dr. Burchard and the fear that it might end or be exposed combined with a turbulent relationship in the home. Witness statements about jealousy over phone contents and prosecutors' descriptions of an intimate transactional tie suggest a pressure cooker where status, money, and control were in constant dispute. The Alford plea itself underscores the weight of the evidence against her regardless of any claims of personal crisis. There is no ambiguity about the harm. A physician who devoted his life to helping others lost his own at the hands of people he had tried to help. Turner's sentence reflects society's rejection of violence as a solution to anger, envy, or financial fear. The story should not inspire fascination with notoriety. It should prompt vigilance about relationships built on exploitation and power imbalances, and respect for the fragile trust that binds communities. Whatever the stresses that preceded this crime, the moral truth is simple choices were made and they destroyed a life. Justice demanded accountability, and the memory of Dr. Thomas Kirk Burchard deserves nothing less. 2. Shevhuan Miller. Shevhuan Miller was 23 years old when police in Las Vegas arrested her after the death of her boyfriend's daughter, 5-year-old Jania Russell. Little about Miller's occupation or long-term plans appeared in public records, but friends and neighbors described a young couple sharing a home and responsibilities for a child who was not Miller's own. Before this case, there was no public persona to speak of, no community spotlight, no career profile, only a private domestic life that, as investigators later said, masked conflict and neglect with devastating consequences. The picture that emerged in court pointed to mounting pressures in the household. Prosecutors argued that Miller displayed hostility towards the child and an alarming indifference to her well-being, an attitude that escalated into control and cruelty rather than care. They highlighted hours when medical help was not sought as Jania's condition worsened, casting those choices as deliberate neglect. While no formal psychological diagnosis was presented to excuse her actions, the state's narrative underscored a pattern of anger and avoidance where responsibility was deflected until it was too late. In early September of 2019, emergency responders were called only after Jania stopped breathing. The child was pronounced dead that same day. The Clark County coroner determined that she died from blunt force injuries with evidence of harm across much of her body, findings consistent with prolonged physical abuse. Investigators said the explanations from Miller and the child's father, Richard Davis, shifted repeatedly, changing details about what supposedly happened inside the home. The contradictions drew sharper attention to the timeline, the injuries, and the lack of medical care at critical moments. This was not a tragedy of mystery. It was a tragedy of choices avoided until the very end. Detectives built the case through the autopsy interviews and the couple's own statements. Nearly a year after Miller's arrest, Davis himself was booked on related charges, including murder and several counts of child abuse after authorities reviewed the coroner's findings. But the trial that came first was Miller's. In the summer of 2022, a jury convicted her of first-degree murder and child abuse. The state emphasized her failure to obtain medical aid and her lack of remorse, while the defense offered little that could overcome the physical evidence and shifting accounts. Public coverage was steady and somber, and the community's grief was centered on a child whose life had been cut short inside the very home that should have protected her. At sentencing that September, District Judge Tiara Jones imposed an indeterminate prison term ranging from 20 to 50 years for the murder and abuse convictions. The structure of the sentence means Miller must serve at least 20 years before she can seek parole, and the maximum term allows the court to recognize the full measure of harm. Reporters noted that she was 26 years old at the time of sentencing, a stark reminder of how quickly violence and neglect can transform every life orbiting it. The legal outcome did not restore what was lost, but it delivered accountability in the only way the law can provide. What then motivated this crime? The record supports a grim mixed resentment, a desire for control, and the willingness to ignore a child's suffering to avoid consequences. Experts did not present a psychiatric defense that mitigated responsibility. Instead, the evidence showed decisions repeated, escalating, and ultimately fatal. The motive was not a sudden delusion or an unforeseeable snap. It was a pattern of harm and indifference that the jury recognized for what it was. There is only one moral conclusion. A child depended on the adults in her home and was failed at every turn. No stress, no insecurity, and no relationship dynamic can justify that betrayal. The sentence stands as a public statement that children's lives are not negotiable and that silence in the face of suffering is complicity. Justice requires more than punishment. It demands that communities stay alert to signs of abuse and act before a life is taken. Jania Russell deserved safety, joy, and a future. She received none of those because of choices Miller made, and that is why society must condemn these crimes without hesitation. 3. Nicole Dattke. Nicole Dattke was 34 years old when she was arrested in northern Nevada, a woman without a public-facing career or notable social profile known mainly to local officers and probation staff. Investigators would later say she moved within a small circle around Sparks and Reno, staying at apartments and motels, and navigating an unstable life with brushes against the law. Before the shooting that brought her name into headlines, there was no curated persona, only a private existence and a criminal history that included prior felony convictions in Utah and Nevada. The victim, Michael Krantz, was 58 years old, a Sparks resident whose final night unfolded at a modest complex near a roadside motel. Prosecutors did not describe a single explosive event that set the crime in motion. Instead, the picture was of short-term decisions layered over longer-term instability. In the days before the shooting, a handgun was reported stolen from a nearby apartment. Detectives later said the unrecovered weapon's make and caliber matched the firearm that killed Krantz. The state emphasized Dattke's record prior convictions for theft escape and drug possession, and argued that these patterns reflected risk-taking disregard for the law and a willingness to deflect accountability. None of this explained motive in the classic sense. It framed a context of poor choices, strained relationships, and a trajectory pointed toward harm. Late in September of 2019, Sparks police answered a call at the Campion Motel on 22nd Street. Just after daybreak, officers found Michael Krantz outside one of the apartments with a fatal gunshot wound to his abdomen. What followed was careful, methodical police work. Inside the apartment, detectives recovered a fired cartridge case and a fired bullet consistent with a 9mm weapon. They also noted ordinary items that raised uncomfortable questions: a diaper, a child's toy, and a bag of women's clothing. Surveillance footage from the complex showed a woman pushing a stroller and arriving at the apartment around 10 at night. Near sunrise, the same woman left carrying a child in a car seat and walking toward Rail City Casino. Investigators identified Nicole Dattke with help from her probation officer. Questioned by police, she denied being at Krantz's apartment, saying she was headed to breakfast instead. Forensic testing later found her DNA on clothing inside the victim's home. The case moved quickly once the evidence aligned. Detectives tied the stolen handgun report to a residence connected to Dattke's boyfriend, where they found a gun box and property linked to the theft, though the firearm itself was never recovered. Prosecutors charged Dattke, and in Washoe County District Court, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In the summer of 2020, a judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Because of her existing case in Churchill County, the court ordered the life term to run consecutive to that separate sentence, citing her criminal history and the senseless nature of the killing. Local coverage was steady and restrained. The district attorney's office underscored that the community had lost a man's life to a crime without purpose. What motivated Nicole Dattke remains murky. Investigators did not present a clinical diagnosis that would explain the shooting, and no expert testimony at sentencing offered a psychological excuse. The record instead supports a pragmatic, sobering conclusion: an escalating chain of decisions being present at the victim's apartment overnight, denying it afterward, and the link to a recently stolen handgun revealed indifference to consequences and to human life. Prosecutors called the murder senseless, a label that fits when the evidence shows opportunity and disregard rather than passion delusion or clear gain. There is no redemption in the facts. Michael Krantz did not come home because of someone else's choices, and a community was left to absorb a loss that cannot be measured. The sentence does not restore a life, but it affirms a standard. When a person takes another's life, accountability must follow. This story should not glamorize the defendant or dwell on spectacle. It should remind us to take seriously the quiet warning signs: serial unlawful behavior, stolen weapons, shifting stories, and to value the ordinary dignity of the people most at risk when those signs are ignored. Justice in this case means telling the truth about what happened and refusing to soften the blame that squarely belongs to the person who pulled events toward tragedy. 4. Elinor Indico. Elinor Indico was around 30 years old at the time of her arrest, a Las Vegas resident without a widely public-facing career. Family was at the center of her daily life. She had been living with her brother Aristeo and his wife Ashley Indico, who was 26 years old and expecting a child. To neighbors, they were one family under one roof. Behind that, picture court records and news reports described tension in the home and a history of conflict between the two women. On the night that would change everything, those private strains came into the open. The circumstances that led to the killing were rooted in a domestic dispute. According to investigators and courtroom testimony, the argument centered on whether Elinor would move out of the apartment and on concerns about her behavior inside the home. Prosecutors later told jurors that this was not a sudden, incomprehensible attack, but the culmination of a simmering feud. While the defense suggested fear and self-defense, the overall narrative presented in court was one of escalating hostility within a family already under stress. None of these pressures explain or excuse the outcome. They form the backdrop against which responsibility would be judged. In mid-October of 2013, a fight inside the apartment turned deadly. Ashley, 9 months pregnant, suffered fatal stab wounds and the unborn child did not survive. At least one of Ashley's young children witnessed the violence, a detail that underscored the trauma seared into the household. Police responded to the scene where they encountered a chaotic aftermath and competing accounts of what happened. Elinor claimed she had acted in self-defense during a confrontation that moved through different rooms. But physical evidence documented by detectives and later summarized by the state Supreme Court showed a sustained struggle and injuries that in the court's view contradicted her claim. From the beginning, the investigation was anchored by witness statements, scene evidence, and Elinor's own shifting explanations. Early reporting noted her age at arrest and identified the relationship between the women. Grand jury proceedings led to an indictment, and the case moved toward trial. In the spring of 2018, a jury found Elinor Indico guilty of first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon manslaughter for the death of the unborn child and child abuse or neglect. Weeks later, a district judge imposed life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. In the courtroom, Ashley's husband Elinor's brother described his grief and anger. Prosecutors called the killing disturbing and emphasized that a child in the home would remember the day his family was torn apart. On appeal, the Nevada Supreme Court affirmed the conviction. While the justices noted one evidentiary error regarding how the trial court limited certain defense evidence, they concluded that the mistake did not affect the verdict because the record contained substantial proof of guilt. The High Court's summary emphasized the apartment setting the presence of the children and the nature of the struggle, and it found that the physical evidence did not support self-defense. These legal findings, taken together with the jury's verdict, frame the most credible understanding of what occurred and why the law imposed its harshest sanction short of death. Psychologically, the case shows a familiar but devastating pattern. Family conflict spiraling into lethal violence compounded by resentment, instability, and a refusal to walk away. No expert testimony at sentencing or on appeal offered a diagnosis that would mitigate responsibility. And the court record presents motive, in plain terms anger, within a household, a dispute over control of the living situation, and an escalation that ended in irreparable loss. In this story, motive is not a mystery. It is the ordinary bitterness of a feud that should have been diffused long before anyone was hurt. There is only one moral judgment to make. A pregnant mother was killed, a child who had not yet taken a breath was lost, and young children witnessed the destruction of their family. Whatever frustrations existed in that home, they could never justify taking a life. The sentence recognizes that truth and signals a communal boundary that must never be crossed. Remember Ashley Indico. Remember the children who lived through that day and reject any narrative that seeks to soften accountability for a crime that shattered a family from the inside. 5. Danielle Slaughter. Danielle Slaughter was 27 years old when Las Vegas police arrested her after the death of her daughter, a 6-year-old named Kyla Franks. There was no celebrity, no public persona, just a young mother living in a modest home on the west side of the city. Friends and neighbors left few footprints in the press about her work life or ambitions. What emerged instead was a portrait built from court records and interviews, a mother who had struggled with sleeplessness, a tangle of spiritual fears, and a house that would become a crime scene. In the days before the killing, Slaughter told detectives she felt an evil presence in the home. She had been taking a caffeinated weight loss supplement and reported that she had barely slept. Reporters at the time noted those claims while also quoting police caution that the product's role was uncertain. What is clear is that her mental state deteriorated. By the time the case reached trial years later, a judge would formally find her guilty, but mentally ill, acknowledging serious illness while holding her fully accountable under Nevada law. In mid-March of 2012, inside that Las Vegas home, Kyla was attacked with a pair of scissors. The details in court focused on method and sequence, not spectacle. A sudden burst of violence, multiple wounds, a child who could not be saved. Shortly afterward, officers encountered Slaughter running unclothed along a neighborhood street, her hands stained, screaming, and disoriented. When confronted, she made a haunting declaration that the blood was from the Lamb of God, words that underscored the depth of her break from reality. Those statements, captured in reports and later retold in court, framed the psychological tension at the center of the case. The investigation moved with careful urgency. Detectives documented the scene, gathered the scissors, and took statements. Slaughter was hospitalized, then booked into jail. Early hearings were chaotic. On at least one occasion, she refused to leave her cell. Her attorneys later entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, setting the stage for expert evaluations and a courtroom reckoning about responsibility. Ultimately, a bench trial replaced a jury, and in early July of 2017, the judge delivered a verdict guilty of first-degree murder but mentally ill, a finding that preserved punishment while directing that her illness be treated in custody. News accounts at the time reported that the sentence would be life in prison and that given the law's structure and the deadly weapon enhancement parole eligibility would not arrive for more than 2 decades. At sentencing, Nevada's framework for guilty but mentally ill defendants required the judge to order appropriate mental health treatment during confinement without reducing the penalty for the crime itself. The message was explicit: serious illness can be recognized, and treatment can be mandated, but neither diminishes the legal consequences for killing a child. Coverage emphasized that the minimum time to be served would be measured in decades, reflecting both the gravity of the offense and the finding that a deadly weapon had been used. What motivated Danielle Slaughter in the simplest sense was not revenge, greed, or thrill-seeking. It was a mind in crisis. Yet the law draws a hard line between explanation and excuse. Judges weighed testimony about sleeplessness, spiritual delusions, and dietary stimulants, then concluded that even amid mental illness, she acted in a way that met the elements of first-degree murder under the child abuse felony murder rule. That legal conclusion rejects any narrative that would soften accountability while still acknowledging the reality of psychiatric suffering. The moral judgment here is stark and non-negotiable. A child's life was taken inside her own home, a place meant to be safe. No fear, no vision, no rush of panic can justify that outcome. The sentence recognizes the truth that society must protect its most vulnerable, and that mental illness, while real and deserving of treatment, cannot be a shield against responsibility for irreversible harm. Remember Kyla Franks. Remember that vigilance matters about untreated crisis, about escalating behavior, about children in distress, and that justice requires both accountability and clarity. We condemn these crimes without hesitation because a community that wavers sends the wrong message to those who depend on it most. 6. Brandy Stutzman. Brandy Stutzman was 31 years old when Las Vegas police arrested her in connection with the death of her estranged husband, Joe Stutzman, a 32-year-old military aircraft mechanic who spent long stretches deployed overseas. To neighbors, the couple appeared to be navigating a difficult separation while raising a young son. In court, prosecutors described a private life far more turbulent, a home that turned into a hangout for teenagers while Joe was away, and a wife who they said cultivated influence over a much younger friend. Those characterizations came not as gossip, but as part of a capital murder case that would soon command headlines. The pressures inside that household were framed in stark terms at trial. According to the state, financial motives and a desire to be well off without her husband blended with need for control and attention. Prosecutors told jurors that Brandy talked openly about life without Joe, floated multiple plans to end his life, and surrounded herself with teenagers she supplied with alcohol and a sense of belonging. The defense countered that a young admirer acted alone out of misguided devotion. Whatever the competing narratives, the record shows escalation manipulation and a deliberate effort to put a deadly plan in motion. In early November of 2010, inside Joe's northern Las Vegas Valley home, 19-year-old Jeremiah Merriweather confronted him. Joe suffered multiple stab wounds and died. In the hours around the killing, prosecutors said Brandy's actions told their own story. She helped dispose of the killer's clothing, sent her husband text messages as if unaware of his fate, and later walked to a neighbor's house to report that something was wrong. The picture was of orchestration and then performance, preparing an ambush, then feigning shock. Merriweather, who had once denied involvement, ultimately admitted he carried out the attack and testified that Brandy urged him forward. He told jurors he believed removing Joe would improve his relationship with her. Detectives built the case on statements, timelines, and a series of stark details: the late-night approach to the house, the shifting stories that followed, and testimony that Brandy asked, "Are you sure he's dead?" after reconnecting with Merriweather. He pleaded guilty before Brandy went to trial, and facing his own punishment, took the stand against her. After several days of testimony, a Clark County jury convicted Brandy Stutzman of first-degree murder and burglary. Days later, the same panel chose a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, rejecting the death penalty that would have made her the only woman on Nevada's death row at that time. Reporters noted prosecutors' statement afterward. Justice, they said, had finally been served for Joseph Stutzman and his family. Why did she do it? Jurors heard two central theories. Prosecutors argued greed and manipulation, pointing to a life insurance policy that could pay upward of $213,000, and to a pattern of recruiting teens to her side. The defense insisted she neither knew of any payout nor controlled the killer, portraying Merriweather as a love-struck youth who acted on his own. Appellate courts later upheld the verdict, acknowledging minor evidentiary disputes, but concluding the record supported the jury's findings. The most credible reading of the case is not a single explosive moment, but a sustained campaign of influence that ended in lethal violence. The moral judgment is unambiguous. A husband was slain in his own home, and a child lost his father because an adult chose manipulation over the hard work of ending a marriage lawfully. No dream of money, freedom, or attention can justify that choice. The life without parole sentence does not restore Joe's life, but it draws a clear line for the rest of us. When someone uses influence to turn another person into a weapon, accountability must be total. Remember Joseph Stutzman, and remember how easily whispered plans can become irreversible harm. This story is not a spectacle. It is a warning about greed, about the lure of control, and about the absolute duty to reject anyone who treats human life as a means to an end. 7. Toni Fratto. Toni Fratto was a high school senior from West Wendover, a small desert town straddling the Nevada-Utah line. She was 18 years old at the time of the crime, and 19 at sentencing, a teenager known among classmates as quiet religious and intensely devoted to her boyfriend, Cody Patton. Friends recalled plans for the two to marry, and reporters later noted that Patton even lived for a time with Fratto's family, blurring the line between young romance and adult responsibility. Before the killing, there was no criminal history or public persona that hinted at what would follow, only a tightly bound relationship and a school community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. What simmered beneath the surface was jealousy and fear of abandonment. Journal entries and interviews described Fratto's insecurity about Patton's longtime friend and classmate Michaela Mickey Costanzo, a popular athlete and good student. Those who read Fratto's writings said they revealed an intense dislike and a fixation on Mickey's connection to Patton. Investigators and journalists later framed the emotional backdrop as a volatile triangle, a possessive bond, a boyfriend with a temper, and a rival, real or imagined, onto whom every anxious thought was projected. There is no medical diagnosis in the record that excuses what happened. There is a pattern of escalating resentment that set the stage for violence. In early March of 2011, after track practice, Mickey left West Wendover High School and did not make it home. Searchers found her days later in a shallow grave off a remote road near the state line. Evidence and interviews placed Fratto and Patton with Mickey in the desert that evening. In Fratto's own accounts, recorded first at a defense lawyer's office and later given to police, she admitted being present and described holding Mickey down while Patton attacked her, a description that investigators said fit the physical evidence without requiring graphic detail here. The desert, setting the secrecy and the betrayal of a classmate, gave the case its haunting weight. Detectives closed in quickly. School surveillance helped reconstruct movements, and the recorded confession Fratto voluntarily gave to Patton's attorney became pivotal because it was not protected by attorney-client privilege. Within months, she accepted a plea deal to second-degree murder and agreed to testify against Patton. In the spring of 2012, a judge sentenced Fratto to life in prison with the possibility of parole. After 18 years, a structure that combined a life term with a consecutive deadly weapon enhancement, extending the minimum time she must serve. Patton pleaded guilty to first-degree murder later that year and received life without the possibility of parole. Public reporting on the verdicts emphasized the community's grief and the court's conclusion that jealousy and manipulation had spiraled into a planned deadly assault on a teenager. What motivated Toni Fratto, according to the most credible evidence, was possessive jealousy harnessed to a dependent, lopsided romance. Her diary and later interviews point to fear that Patton would leave her for Mickey and to a willingness to prove loyalty by participating in a crime she could have refused. Experts did not present a psychiatric defense that mitigated intent or responsibility. Prosecutors and judges alike treated the case as a cautionary story about coercive bonds when identity and worth are outsourced to another person's approval. Rage can masquerade as love, and moral judgment can collapse. The moral line is clear and unforgiving. A 16-year-old girl with a full life ahead of her was taken from her family, classmates, and community because two people chose violence over dignity and truth. No heartbreak, no rumor, and no fear of losing a relationship can excuse that decision. The sentence ensures accountability, but justice also asks for vigilance from parents, schools, and friends when envy, isolation, and control begin to eclipse empathy. Remember Michaela Mickey Costanzo for the person she was not, for the cruelty that ended her life, and reject any narrative that softens responsibility for those who turned jealousy into irreversible harm. 8. Amy DeChant. Amy DeChant was in her late 40s when Las Vegas detectives began looking at her in the disappearance of Bruce Charles Weinstein, a bookmaker she had been dating. Friends said she had come to Nevada for a fresh start, built a small carpet cleaning business, and developed a taste for poker rooms where she first met Bruce. He was a larger-than-life presence with a close family and a steady stream of clients. She was articulate, social, and soon moved into his Southwest home. To some, the pairing looked like companionship. To others, it looked transactional, especially as money and lifestyle became the quiet center of their relationship. Tension gathered around finances and control. Bruce was known to deal in cash, and people close to him worried about the influence that money seemed to have on Amy's choices. Investigators would later describe shifting explanations from her when hard questions arrived, the sort of improvisation that signals a person trying to outrun facts. There was no clinical diagnosis offered in court to explain those choices. What the record shows is a pattern ambition for comfort, easy access to cash, and a willingness to bend a story when it served her. In early July of 1996, Bruce failed to come home. His mother, alarmed by silence from a son who normally checked in, went to the house and found Amy scrubbing damp carpet. At first, Amy said Bruce had gone out and might meet her later on a planned trip. Days later, she told a different story. Masked intruders connected to organized crime had stormed the house, killed Bruce, and ordered her to clean up and keep quiet. Weeks after he vanished, searchers found Bruce's remains in a remote desert area outside Las Vegas. The settings in these scenes, a quiet home, a hurried cleanup, a barren stretch of Nevada earth, spoke volumes without graphic detail. Once detectives dug in, the picture sharpened. A private investigator hired by Bruce's family steered police toward Amy, and scene work documented a blood trail inside the house that aligned poorly with her shifting accounts. In the months that followed, Amy left Nevada. She was stopped in Maryland with a large amount of cash and false identification. After posting bail, she fled again. A national broadcast of America's Most Wanted generated tips that led to her capture in Florida, and she was returned to Clark County to face charges. A grand jury indicted her and a former employee, Robert Jones, in connection with Bruce's killing and the theft of his money. The first trial ended with a sweeping conviction. In the autumn of 1998, a jury found Amy guilty of first-degree murder with use of a deadly weapon and robbery, and a judge imposed 2 consecutive life terms without parole, plus additional time for the theft. 2 years later, Nevada's highest court threw out the verdict, ruling that a veteran investigator's testimony and the prosecutor's repetition of it had improperly branded Amy's account a fairy tale, undermining the jury's role as the judge of credibility. Rather than face a second trial, Amy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the summer of 2001. That autumn, the court sentenced her to a term of 25 years with the possibility of parole after 10 crediting time already served. What drove her? The most credible reading anchored in court records and contemporary reporting is greed and control. Prosecutors argued she targeted the cash that surrounded Bruce's work. Investigators tied her to money and flight, not to panic or confusion. No psychological assessment softened the legal conclusion. The motive line is stark financial gain followed by deception and evasion when consequences loomed. The moral judgment is equally stark. A man was taken from his family, leaving an empty chair at gatherings and a grief that has lasted far longer than any prison term. Changing stories, false leads, and years of litigation could not hide the simple truth that a human life was treated as a means to money. The final sentence recognizes society's boundary. No desire for comfort or security justifies violence, and no lie can purchase innocence. Remember Bruce Charles Weinstein, not for the profession that made him a target, but for the loved ones who asked only for the truth and for the accountability that at long last arrived. 9. Priscilla Joyce Ford. Priscilla Joyce Ford was a former school teacher who had recently moved to Reno, when at 51 years old she became the focus of one of Nevada's darkest holidays. Born in Michigan and educated enough to teach in one-room schools before moving around the country, she arrived in Reno only weeks before Thanksgiving and took a seasonal job wrapping packages. To neighbors, she seemed reserved, orderly, and intensely private. That public image would shatter in an afternoon on South Virginia Street, where crowded sidewalks turned into scenes of panic and grief. Behind the outward quiet was years of documented mental illness. Court records and medical testimony later described diagnoses that included paranoid schizophrenia and long stretches of delusions shaped by religious themes. She had been evaluated repeatedly, deemed incompetent for trial, treated at Nevada's psychiatric facility for criminal defendants, and then ruled competent to stand trial. In the courtroom, she insisted on testifying and told jurors she was a divine figure incapable of sin statements that revealed how far her thinking had drifted from reality but did not remove legal responsibility. On Thanksgiving Day, in the year 1980, Ford steered her Lincoln Continental onto the sidewalk of downtown Reno and drove along the pedestrian route for blocks. In moments, 6 people were dead and more than 20 others were hurt. Witnesses described a deliberate path that left holiday strollers scrambling for cover. Police stopped her at the scene. From the very beginning, the facts were not in dispute. She was the driver. The car was mechanically sound and the casualties were devastating. What the trial would fight over was her state of mind. The investigation moved fast, but the case took years to resolve in court. A long trial unfolded featuring psychiatric experts, eyewitnesses, and Ford herself. Jurors rejected her plea of not guilty by reason of insanity and convicted her of multiple counts of first-degree murder and attempted murder. In late March and April of the year 1982, they returned a sentence of death, a penalty later upheld on appeal. Ford remained the only woman on Nevada's death row for decades. She continued to file appeals without success, and in the end she died in custody from complications of emphysema, still under sentence of death. Why did she do it? The record offers two overlapping answers. First, a profound psychiatric illness that had been noted for years, marked by delusions and grandiose beliefs. Second, a legal conclusion that at the crucial moment she still knew right from wrong. Nevada uses the Monotone rule, which asks whether a defendant understood the nature and wrongfulness of their act. After months of testimony, judges and jurors decided that her mental illness, while real, did not meet the standard for legal insanity. The result is a portrait that is both complicated and unyielding, a woman deeply unwell who nonetheless chose to turn a car into a weapon with consequences that can never be undone. There is no softening what happened on that sidewalk. Families carried grief for years. Survivors lived with injuries and memories etched into every holiday season. Mental illness explains context but never excuses carnage. The state's response conviction, death sentence, and lifelong confinement drew a bright line that public safety must hold. Remember the victims whose day turned into tragedy and the community that bore witness. This story stands as a warning that when warning signs collide with access to harm, vigilance matters, and that justice must be firm-focused and always centered on those who were lost. 10. Carolyn Ann King. Carolyn Ann King was 28 years old when a quiet central Pennsylvania town learned her name the worst possible way. Friends knew her as a young woman in an intense relationship with Bradley Martin, a man several years younger whose life was already tangled with the criminal justice system. King did not have a public profile. She moved in ordinary circles around Lebanon County. Yet, by early autumn, she and Martin were on the road with a stolen car, stolen money, and a trail that began in a neighbor's home and ended in the high desert of Nevada. Prosecutors later argued that the trigger for what followed was a mix of money manipulation and a deepening criminal bond. At later proceedings, defense attorneys pointed to claims that King had endured abuse and long periods of depression and substance use earlier in life. Those factors were offered as mitigation, not as excuses. The picture that emerges is bleak but clear, a couple willing to trade anyone's safety for cash transportation, and the fantasy of escape pushing past every moral boundary in a matter of weeks. In mid-September of 1993, the pair went to the Palmyra townhouse of Guy Goodman, a 74-year-old florist who had been corresponding with Martin while he was incarcerated. Inside that basement, investigators later concluded Goodman was attacked and left to suffocate after a plastic bag was taped over his head. King and Martin stole his car credit card and checkbook. They drove west using his accounts along the way, and by the end of September they were seen in Bismarck, North Dakota, where they abducted Donna Mae Martz, a 59-year-old woman, from a hotel parking lot. Days later they crossed into Nevada. Near Elko, in early October, Martz was taken into the desert and killed with a .357 Magnum revolver. The couple kept moving until law enforcement caught up to them in Arizona on October 5th after a police chase. Their arrest ended the spree, but it did not close the wounds left behind. Investigators pieced together the route from receipts, surveillance, and witness accounts. Eventually, both King and Martin admitted their roles in the Nevada killing as part of separate proceedings. In Pennsylvania, a jury convicted both defendants of first-degree murder in the autumn of 1994 and imposed death sentences for the killing of Goodman. On direct appeal, the state's highest court affirmed the convictions. Years later, in post-conviction review, that same court granted King a new penalty hearing to consider mitigation that had not been fully presented, and in early March of 2015, she was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. In Nevada, she had already received a life sentence for her role in Martz's murder, ordered to run consecutive to her Pennsylvania punishment. What motivated Carolyn King, the record points to a straightforward, chilling calculus robbery and self-preservation fused to a relationship that normalized escalating harm. Mitigation evidence described a past marred by abuse and depression, but no clinical finding removed her agency. Prosecutors emphasized the cold choices enter a mentor's home silence him to steal what he had, kidnap a stranger, and keep going. Judges and juries agreed that whatever her history, she acted with intent and with awareness of right and wrong. The law responded accordingly. There is only one moral conclusion. 2 lives were ended so that a pair on the run could have money, a car, and a head start. The grief of Guy Goodman's family and of Donna Mae Martz's loved ones can never be measured, and no sentence erases the fear those final hours left behind. We should resist any narrative that glamorizes a cross-country spree. This is not romance. It is predation. Justice demanded permanence, and it delivered. Remember the victims, and remember what happens when greed and loyalty to the wrong person eclipse conscience. 11. Jill Rockcastle. Jill Rockcastle was 49 years old when Las Vegas police traced a domestic horror to a glass tower overlooking the Strip. She was the wife of William Gustafic, a 44-year-old former California chiropractor who had reinvented himself as a professional poker player. Friends described a couple split between Nevada and the coast, living in a luxury condominium high above South Las Vegas Boulevard while chasing a version of the high life. Publicly, he was gregarious and ambitious. She managed details, travel, and business errands. Privately, by her own later account, the marriage had curdled into suspicion, financial strain, and late-night arguments. In the months before the killing, tension sharpened. Rockcastle would later claim that Gustafic was using drugs and steroids, that he was volatile, and that she feared him. In a lengthy letter found after the crime, she portrayed herself as a woman worn down by chaos, debt, and escalating intimidation. Prosecutors countered that there was no credible evidence she met the legal criteria for battered spouse syndrome. They argued that whatever problems existed inside that home, she retained independence, traveled freely, and made her own choices. Those dueling narratives framed the case an unraveling relationship against a backdrop of ambition and excess, and a fatal decision that could not be undone. On the night of April 13, 2007, inside a 23rd floor unit at Panorama Towers, an argument turned deadly. In statements through counsel, Rockcastle said Gustafic grabbed her by the hair and that she seized a knife he had been using to open packages, striking again and again in a panic. She left the scene. Police responding to a welfare check followed blood evidence into the primary bedroom and found Gustafic beyond help. Detectives recovered a knife near the building's refuse chute. Days later, officers in San Luis Obispo, California, found Rockcastle unconscious in a small inn after what authorities called a suicide attempt. She was treated, arrested, and returned to Clark County. The investigation centered on physical evidence in the condo, conflicting statements about abuse, and the couple's recent movements. Prosecutors filed an open murder charge. As hearings unfolded, Rockcastle's defense emphasized fear and mental collapse. The state emphasized a lack of corroboration for her claims and the sheer number of wounds. Rather than proceed to a jury, Rockcastle entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder in mid-September of 2008, acknowledging that the evidence could convict her while not admitting the factual allegations. In mid-November of that year, District Judge Michael Villani imposed a sentence of 10 years to life in the Nevada Department of Corrections, making her eligible to seek parole after serving the minimum term. Media coverage noted the contrast between an aspirational lifestyle and its devastating end. Friends and relatives spoke of a man whose search for success had led him to Las Vegas, and of a family left with questions no sentence could answer. What then motivated Jill Rockcastle? The record points to a combustible mix of marital conflict, financial pressure, and her own account of fear, but no clinical diagnosis that erased her agency or responsibility. Experts did not offer a finding that she was legally insane, and the court, faced with the facts and her plea, treated the case as a second-degree murder born of rage and desperation, not self-defense. There is only one moral conclusion. A husband lost his life in the place where he should have felt safest, and a family must live with that absence. Claims of fear must always be investigated with care, but fear cannot excuse a choice to kill when lawful options exist. The law's response drew a clear boundary. Whatever the stresses of money, fame, or a troubled marriage, violence is never a remedy. Remember William Gustafik as more than a headline, and let this story stand as a warning against letting conflict, pride, or panic eclipse the duty to walk away. 12. Margaret Rudin. Margaret Rudin was in her early 50s when Las Vegas police began asking difficult questions about the disappearance of her husband, Ronald Rudin, a real estate figure in his mid-60s. She was known locally as an antiques dealer with a polished social presence, the kind of person who could talk history with customers and glide through charity events with ease. Their courtship had been fast, their marriage a tangle of affection, money, and rumor. By the winter of 1994, that image of a comfortable life would collapse under the weight of a missing person report and a desert discovery no family should ever face. Those who later stood in court described a relationship under strain. Prosecutors argued that divorce and the possibility of losing access to wealth was looming, painting a motive rooted in money and control. The defense countered with a different story, pointing toward other people who might have wanted Ronald harmed and insisting Margaret had no reason to kill. What is indisputable is that this marriage carried volatility, and that volatility became the prism through which investigators interpreted every decision, every purchase, and every silence that followed his disappearance. In mid-December of 1994, Ronald vanished. About a month later, anglers near Nelson's Landing on Lake Mojave found charred human remains later identified as his through dental records. The medical examiner determined he had been shot in the head multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon. Investigators also recovered remnants of an antique trunk, a detail that took on outsized meaning when a local dealer said he had sold a similar trunk to Margaret months earlier. The state alleged the body had been transported to the burn site. The defense attacked the trunk story and the burn theory as speculation. The facts the jury would eventually hear were stark but not graphic: gunfire, a desert fire, and a family waiting for answers. The investigation stretched on. During that time, Margaret left Nevada. She was eventually recognized in Massachusetts after being featured on America's Most Wanted and was returned to Las Vegas to stand trial. In early spring of 2001, after a long, high-profile proceeding, a jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. That summer, a judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Years of appeals followed. A bid for a new trial succeeded in district court and was then reversed, and still the litigation continued. In early January of 2020, Margaret was paroled. 2 years later, a federal judge vacated her murder conviction based on ineffective assistance of counsel. In late 2024, prosecutors moved to dismiss the case and a judge ended the charges. Today, Margaret Rudin is no longer convicted of Ronald's murder. At the same time, law enforcement has not named anyone else as responsible. What could have motivated the killing prosecutor's narrative always centered on money and divorce, a classic calculus of greed. They pointed to a clause in Ronald's will that demanded a robust investigation if he died by violent means, suggesting he feared being targeted. The defense maintained she was being framed by circumstance, poor lawyering, and the gravitational pull of a lurid nickname. A fair counting of the record separates allegation from certainty. There is no laboratory test for motive. Only inferences drawn from behavior and benefit questions that remained even after the conviction was set aside. There is a line: this story will not cross the life of Ronald Rudin mattered more than any courtroom headline. Whoever killed him tore a hole in a family and in a community that watched the case for years. The legal system's duty is to ensure both accountability and fairness. It delivered a conviction, then conceded that the process had been flawed and ultimately dismissed the case. That sequence does not lighten the loss. It underscores a sober truth: justice must be meticulous because the stakes are permanent. Remember Ronald. Not the spectacle. Remember that wealth and status never place a person beyond harm, and that every allegation demands rigorous proof before we speak of guilt. 13. Kellyanne Ryan. Kellyanne Ryan was in her early 30s when a Las Vegas scandal transformed a fitness celebrity into a convicted felon. A Minnesota native who grew up in gymnastics and later studied journalism, She built a public persona on discipline choreography and the athletic sparkle that earned her national fitness titles. Offstage, she was married to professional bodybuilder Craig Titus, and together they chased endorsements appearances and the next big break. By late 2005, they were also employers. Their live-in personal assistant, Melissa James, a 29-year-old aspiring entrepreneur, was part of their household and their plans. Beneath the polished image were fractures. Friends and investigators later described a home strained by jealousy, business disputes, and drug use. Prosecutors would highlight admissions of steroid use and painkillers, and witnesses spoke about methamphetamine in their circle. Rumors of an affair between Titus and James created a volatile triangle, while accusations that James had accessed bank accounts added fuel. None of that excuses what followed, but it sketches a house where resentment, ego, and substance abuse were turning everyday arguments into unpredictable flashpoints. In mid-December of 2005, Melissa James vanished. The next day, a charred car was found off a desert road outside Las Vegas. It was Ryan's red Jaguar, and inside were Melissa's remains. The coroner would ultimately list the cause of death as undetermined. Prosecutors, however, alleged a grim sequence, a confrontation that escalated the use of a stun device, injected opiates, and asphyxiation. Surveillance video captured Ryan buying charcoal starter fluid in the early morning hours. Later, investigators tied fuel purchases to the couple's movements. Ryan and Titus first told police they knew nothing. Then, in later interviews, they claimed Melissa overdosed in the car, that they panicked, wrapped the body, and burned the vehicle to avoid ruinous publicity. Instead of calling for help, they fled Nevada together. A 9-day manhunt ended in Massachusetts, where both were arrested and returned to Clark County. As the legal pressure tightened after months of filings, evolving statements, and forensic reports, the case resolved without a murder trial for Ryan. In late spring of 2008, she entered an Alford plea to arson and to battery with a deadly weapon resulting in substantial bodily harm, a legal position that acknowledges the state has enough evidence to convict while stopping short of admitting the underlying acts. A judge sentenced her to 2 consecutive terms of 3 to 13 years in prison. Titus pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, kidnapping, and arson in a separate deal. The public reaction was a mix of shock and grim resignation. Fans of the sport confronted the collapse of 2 marquee names, while Melissa's family faced a loss no sentence could repair. What motivated Kelly Ryan? The record points to a stew of jealousy, a chaotic household, and drugs potent ingredients for terrible choices. The state's theory placed Titus at the center of Melissa's death and Ryan at the center of the cover-up, with evidence of planning and fire pointing to her hands. Ryan herself told the court she was sorry that she did not kill, but that she helped and failed to stop a catastrophe. That admission does not minimize her responsibility. It underlines it. There is no way to soften the truth. A young woman lost her life, and her final dignity was erased by fire. Whatever the pressures of fame or the temptations of a fast life, destroying evidence and running from accountability are moral failures as well as crimes. Remember Melissa James beyond the headlines. Let this story stand as a clear warning that success and strength mean nothing without conscience, and that when ambition curdles into deception, the law must speak for the silenced. 14. Brenda Stokes Wilson. Brenda Stokes Wilson was about 50 years old when Las Vegas police accused her of a crime that shattered a family and horrified a community. A former blackjack dealer known to co-workers on the Strip, she had spent years in service jobs and was by appearances steady and social. Friends knew her as the on-again, off-again partner of Philip Morris, a father who trusted Stokes Wilson enough to let his 10-year-old daughter Jade spend time with her around the holidays. On the afternoon of December 21st of 2012, Brenda picked Jade up for a Christmas shopping trip. It was supposed to be a simple errand between a trusted adult and a child who loved the season. What followed, prosecutors say, came out of jealousy and a simmering emotional storm. In the days around the crime, Stokes Wilson reportedly told a doctor she felt like she wanted to hurt someone and had stopped taking anti-anxiety medication. Family members and police later pointed to a suspected fixation on a female co-worker, a belief that Philip might be interested in someone else, and a temperament that could turn volatile. Old reports from another state even suggested a prior assault case decades earlier, a charge that was eventually dismissed, but that added to the portrait of a history punctuated by rage. None of those threads excuses what happened. They only sketch the backdrop of escalating instability. The timeline that day was swift and devastating. After Jade climbed into the car for shopping, she did not return home. By evening, Stokes Wilson was at the Bellagio, where she attacked a fellow dealer with razor blades on the gaming floor before security and police subdued her. While she sat under arrest in that separate slashing case, detectives were scrambling to find the missing child. 6 days later, responding to a 911 call, officers discovered a young girl's body in an undeveloped tract far from the shopping center where the outing was supposed to begin. The coroner ruled that Jade died from multiple stab wounds. Prosecutors later said Jade's blood was found on the steering wheel and driver's door handle of the car Brenda had borrowed, and on clothing Brenda wore that day. In the hours after the slashing at the casino, investigators also noted that Stokes Wilson offered no help in the search for the girl she had last been seen with. A Clark County grand jury returned an indictment, first-degree kidnapping, murder, burglary, attempted murder, battery, causing substantial bodily harm and mayhem, all with a deadly weapon enhancement. Stokes Wilson pleaded not guilty at her arraignment in early March of 2013 and remained held without bail at the Clark County Detention Center. Her trial was set for late June of 2014. Public reaction was anguished and angry. Vigils were held for Jade. Her family spoke through tears about a child who did her homework without being asked and loved to sing to her dad. In court hallways, relatives rejected suggestions that anyone but Brenda should be blamed. As for motive, prosecutors described jealousy and spite, an attack intended to wound an adult by harming a child. Court records also captured Stokes Wilson's own statements about wanting hospital admission because he had felt dangerous, and about stopping prescribed medication details that defense counsel weighed in considering mental health arguments. But no psychological report can balance the scales here. Even if emotional illness or resentment pushed her toward violence, those factors do not absolve responsibility for taking a life and terrifying another victim at her workplace. This case is a stark reminder that jealousy coupled with untreated emotional turmoil can escalate to unforgivable acts. A 10-year-old girl lost her future. A family lost their center. There is no framing that reduces the moral weight of that loss. Whatever courtroom arguments might be made, the lasting truth is simple. Children must be protected, and adults who choose violence, especially against the vulnerable, must face the full force of the law. 15. Cathy Woods. Cathy Woods was in her late 20s when police connected her name to the killing of a 19-year-old nursing student in Reno. Born in the early 1950s, she had cycled through periods of severe mental illness and was living as a psychiatric patient at Louisiana State University Medical Center when her path crossed the long, cold investigation into the death of Michelle Mitchell. Mitchell, a beloved University of Nevada, Reno sophomore, had grown up close to her family and was known for her kindness and steady work ethic. On a February afternoon in the mid-1970s, her car stalled near campus. Hours later, she was found in a nearby garage, her life taken by a cut to her throat. The city recoiled. A promising life was gone. Years passed without an arrest. Then, while hospitalized in Louisiana, Woods told staff she had killed a young woman named Michelle in Reno. Accounts of what she said shifted at points. She claimed a role with the FBI at others. She described hearing satanic voices, and she alternated between saying she had offered help with a broken car and alleging a sexual advance that turned violent when rebuffed. To clinicians, the statements came from a deeply unwell woman. To detectives trying to solve a brutal crime, they sounded like a confession. Woods was brought to Nevada, where the case against her formed around those statements. What happened to Michelle is not in dispute. A university student stranded by car trouble was lured or forced into a garage and killed. The prosecution's narrative cast Woods as the attacker, saying she approached the teenager under the pretext of retrieving tools and then turned on her. There were no eyewitnesses placing Woods with Michelle that night. Nonetheless, in the early 1980s, a jury convicted Woods of murder. The Nevada Supreme Court overturned that verdict, but a second trial again ended in conviction. She received life in prison without the possibility of parole, and for decades she was known publicly as Michelle's killer. The case changed with science. After advances in DNA testing, a cigarette butt recovered from that garage was analyzed. The genetic profile did not match Woods. Instead, it matched a man incarcerated in Oregon named Rodney Halbauer, whom authorities later described as a person of interest in a series of Bay Area killings, sometimes called the Gypsy Hill murders. The Washoe County Forensic Lab reported that no DNA from the crime scene belonged to Woods. In response, a Nevada judge granted her a new trial and ordered her released on her own recognizance while the parties prepared for court. For Michelle's family, the revelations reopened painful questions. For Woods's family, they stirred hope that a wrongful conviction might be undone. If Woods had been the killer, prosecutors long argued that rejection and rage fueled her citing her shifting hospital statements. Yet mental health experts warn that people with severe illnesses can produce unreliable accounts, particularly in institutional settings under medication changes or while seeking attention or privileges. This is not an excuse for violence. It is a caution about the fallibility of confession-based prosecutions without solid physical evidence. Michelle Mitchell deserves unambiguous justice. Whoever killed her stole a future and devastated a family. The lesson here is twofold. Our condemnation must always fall on the person who committed the crime, and our system must resist the pull of easy answers when evidence is thin. When science points to a different suspect and no DNA ties a woman to the scene, integrity requires the justice system to correct itself. We honor Michelle not by clinging to a doubtful narrative, but by insisting on truth accountability and the careful, humane use of power in every investigation.